Good evening, good evening. It's a great Monday evening. Welcome, my holy sisters and brothers. That was a nice way to get into the mood for some learning with the Tikon Hatzos Kumsitz band singing the Karl Bach Hallel. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this lovely evening to start the week? Melissa Eitel Jurin says good evening from Great Neck, New York. Stephen Giger says shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Paula Schmidt-Klauser from Chicago. Ed Berg from Galloway, New Jersey. James Roth from Indianapolis. Brandon Christian Sullivan from Knoxville, Tennessee. Sandy McMurray from Michigan. Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. And Dodge Schwantz, shalom from San Diego. Alejandro Martinez says shalom from El Dominicano, the Dominican Republic. Harold Black from Oregon. Bill Eldridge, still in rural Arkansas. Jackie Gorlick says shalom from Alaska. I don't think we've had Alaska before. Welcome, Jackie. Randy Lieberman Herman, shalom from Florida. Stephanie Marie Diaz says shalom aleichem. Martin Wade from Galliano, Louisiana. Brenna Bloomfield from Massachusetts. Gwen Strong from Michigan. Travis Lightcap from Ohio. Grace Schiller Curiali from Miami. And Dodge Schwantz says she is in San Diego, but from Portland, Oregon. May we only hear good news from Portland. Mark Lister is with us. He would agree. Frona Adelson from D.C. All right, my friends. And over on the YouTube side, Lynn in Texas, Debbie Schweigart in New Jersey. All right. So yesterday, we went on a beautiful, colorful digression from the laws of creating an enclosure around a well in a public domain so that we can draw water out of it, since the well itself is a private domain and we want to pull water out of it on Shabbos. We need an enclosure around it, but the sages were lenient, as we saw, in the requirements of that enclosure. Perhaps because these enclosures around wells were originally created to serve festival pilgrims, people going up to Jerusalem during the festivals and bringing their animals with them. We got into a digression that was amazing. It covered some of the history and context and philosophy behind the oral tradition in Judaism. If you missed yesterday's class, highly recommend it. That was Eruvin Daf 21. Today, we're on Daf 22, Chaf Beis. This is chapter 2. We're going to finish our discussion of Mishnah number 1 of chapter 2 and start our discussion of Mishnah number 2. So we're going to continue a little bit with this digression, beautiful digression, and then we're going to get back to the Mishnah. So we learned yesterday at the end of our class that it was Solomon, King Solomon, who instituted the Eruv itself, the idea of an Eruv, as well as the requirement to wash hands before eating a meal. So those laws are not in the Torah. They're essentially decrees of the sages, and they were created by King Solomon. So it's like the sages have a kinship with King Solomon. Why was King Solomon able to issue those decrees? I mean, aside from being the king and so close to God and perhaps the wisest man who ever lived, and it was because there was peace in the land. Until then, there had been so many wars, and it just wasn't deemed appropriate to sort of bring out some of these decrees which would create a fence around the Torah, a fence around certain laws, so to make sure that the people don't come to transgress them, often because the people didn't understand the laws well enough. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that idea because Solomon really made the Torah more available to the people, made sort of the higher wisdom of the Torah scholars, and there were Torah scholars, well, even before the Torah was given, in the sense that there were people studying God's laws and God's will for the people, even before the Torah was given. Jacob studied at the yeshiva of Shem and Eber. Noah studied it and was taught the Torah to his sons. I mean, there was already this tradition even before the Torah was given. But certainly after it was given, there were the more scholarly people who got much more involved in the Torah and at a high level. And it wasn't, so accessible to the average person. And Solomon made it much more accessible to the common people. How did he do that? Through the book of Proverbs. It was Solomon who wrote the book of Proverbs. He also wrote Ecclesiastes, which often seems like, a little bit depressing. It's like this guy who has seen everything, done everything, owned everything, tried everything. He's been there and back, done it all. And in the end, there's nothing new under the sun. So what is the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes? Well, in the end, we don't really know why we exist. There's nothing really much we can add to this world. So do your best, obey the law, and be a decent person. It's almost like the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes. And maybe that was the work of an older Solomon who had seen and done so much and lost so much. Not in terms of wealth, but within his family. I mean, as we see, his heir, his son who ascends the throne after him, really was not worthy of that position. And so for whatever reason, he was not able, like King David was able to raise a King Solomon. King Solomon was not. His son was somewhat incompetent as a king, and it led to the division of Israel into two countries, Judea and the northern kingdom. At any rate, it was the book of Proverbs that really opened up the Torah to a lot of people. And we learned that from Ecclesiastes. So let's see here. We have a verse. So Rava taught, what is the meaning of that which is written? So this is from near the end of Ecclesiastes. And besides being wise, Koheles also taught, so Koheles refers to Solomon himself, also taught the people knowledge, and he weighed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. Rava interpreted homiletically that King Solomon taught the people knowledge, meaning he taught it with accentuation marks in the Torah, and he explained each matter by means of something similar to it. And with regard to, and he weighed and sought out and set in order many proverbs, Ula said that Rabbi Eliezer said, at first the Torah was like a basket without handles until Solomon came and made handles for it. So it was really Solomon who sort of really opened this process that became, kind of an oral law and an oral tradition, not for the, just the very few elite who could understand the Torah at a high level, but he made handles for the Torah so that more people could engage in Torah study, more people could understand, more people could come closer to God, not just through doing mitzvahs, but through Torah study itself. And the book of Proverbs would help them to do that. Okay. Another teaching. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, now this is a little bit hard to understand, right? So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, he's interpreting Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 10, where it says, and he, meaning God, repays them that hate him to his face to destroy them. He repays them that hate him to his face, right? The people who hate God to God's face, to destroy them. He will not be slack to him that hates him. He will repay him to his face, right? So one who is brazen about denying God or denying God's law or just insulting God, sort of like the way that Amalek attacked the Jews right after they were coming out of Egypt on the backs of eagles' wings, on the backs of eagles, right? In other words, God carried us out of Egypt with such open and manifest miracles that everyone knew that the Jews, at least at that time, were, really in God's favor. Who would attack them in that situation? Amalek did. So it was an affront not just to the Jewish people, but even to God. It's an affront to God. But because of this verse, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, were the verse not written in this manner, it would be impossible to utter it in deference to God. For it could be understood, as it were, like a person who bears a burden on his face and wishes to throw it off. In other words, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is saying, this is so anthropomorphic, right? This verse in the Torah seems to say that God takes offense when you insult him, that God gets angry when you hurt his people, that God bears a grudge, as it were. And who are the humans that they should influence God's emotion, an infinite being? It's ridiculous. Something we're going to do in our little corner of the universe is going to anger God, and not only anger him, but really get under God's skin. Obviously, this is all metaphorically, in such a way that God is going to bear a grudge and just wait until he can pay back the person who has offended God in such a way. And so Yehoshua ben Levi is saying we would never say something like that about God, and yet we find it written in the Torah. How is it possible? And on the same subject, right, of sort of that God bears this grudge against the wicked, and so we have, with regard to these words, he shall not be slack to him that hates him, with a capital H. In other words, God will not be slack to repay one who hates God with his actions. And Rabbi Yehuda said, he will not be slack in bringing punishment to him that hates him, but he will be slack in rewarding those who are absolutely righteous. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying, we don't really see in this world that righteous people are rewarded for their righteousness, right? Very often there's very good, very kind people that put the needs of others ahead of their own, and yet they suffer all kinds of indignities in this world. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though the righteous are not rewarded in this world, the wicked are punished in this world. Now that's interesting, because people will often say, and this is called the study of theodicy, how do we reconcile the evil in the world with an omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent God? If God is so powerful and kind, why does he allow so much evil to exist in the world? Now, Rabbi Yehuda isn't taking on the idea of why does he let the wicked, create wickedness in the world at all. What he's saying is that the wicked do get punished in this world, but the righteous, they can expect their reward in the next world, right? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, God is slow to reward the righteous, meaning he'll reward them in the next world, but the wicked do get punished in this world. Now, I think most people, and our first instinct probably for many of us, if not most, is to say, well, no, that doesn't sound right. The wicked aren't punished in this world. But if you think about it, I think Rabbi Yehuda has a point, right? Because the wicked will get away with their wickedness for quite a while, often for, a terrible long time. There's a lot of victims and a lot of people get hurt. But it does seem like ultimately, in most cases, I'm not saying every case, that's for sure, but mostly in this world, eventually people figure out that they've got a rotten apple in their midst, and punishment and just compensation or just consequences flow to the wicked in this world. I'm not saying it always happens, but I think if we look at the trend in this world, vile, vicious people, in the end, everyone around them notices it, realizes what they're doing, and they end up ostracized or punished or imprisoned, or, they get what's coming to them often in this world. And I think, even though that's certainly not an absolute truth, far from it, but I think that I think Rabbi Yehuda is telling us that the wicked are more often punished in this world than the good are rewarded. I think that is true. I think that wickedness shows itself and people respond to it. Whereas goodness and righteousness, especially of the humble people out there, they're often very quiet about it. They make their donations anonymously. They help people without drawing attention to themselves. And they feel good about what they're doing, but they're often not recognized for those good deeds. But Rabbi Yehuda is assuring us God sees and will reward the righteous in the next world. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi then comments on the next line in Deuteronomy, "And you shall keep the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which I command you today to do them." Right? So that's Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 11. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi tells us this means that today, right? It says, you shall do them today, that I command you today to do them, right? So you could read it as, well, this is when God was talking to us in the wilderness, and he's saying, you shall do all these commandments that I'm giving you today. But Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, no, the today is in the wrong, you're misunderstanding the role of the word today in that sentence. God is saying, all these commandments that I give you today, do them. Do them today. In other words, if anytime you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, right, to fulfill an obligation, to do the right thing in this world, anytime you have that opportunity, do it. Because tomorrow is not promised. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? You may not have that opportunity again. And moreover, once you leave this world, right, once we shuffle off the mortal coil, as Shakespeare would say, once we die and we don't have a body, so we are souls. We're going to return to the world of souls. But while we're in this body, while we're in this world, we have bodies. And with those bodies, we can do mitzvahs. We can fulfill our obligations. We can do good deeds. We can fulfill these commandments. In that next world, no, we cannot. We won't have that opportunity to do mitzvahs in the next world. So make sure you do them today. Seize every opportunity to do good and to fulfill biblical obligations in this world, says Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Haggai, and some say Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, says, with regard to another verse in the Torah, Exodus chapter 34, verse 6, and the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, in Hebrew, erech apayim, and abundant in love and truth. So this is the incident in the book of Exodus when Moses says to God, I want to know you better. Obviously, we all have faith in you. You just pulled us out of Egypt by virtue of all these miracles. But I want to know you even better than that. I want to know you. I want to know who you are, what you are. I want to be closer to you. right? I want to understand you, what you are, who you are, where you're coming from. Moses had so much love of God that he just wanted to understand God better in a kind of direct and experiential way. And because God loved Moses more than he ever loved any other prophet before or since, as it says in the Torah, God said, okay, I will show you some of what I am. I can't show you really what I am because no human could experience that and live. Your soul would fly out of your body. But I'm going to show you more of what I am, what God is, than any other human has seen before or since. And so God puts Moses in this cleft in the rock where he'll be protected, and God sort of covers Moses with a protective shield, as it were, and then passes by, and he says, you won't be able to see my face, but you'll see me from behind. In other words, you'll get more of a sense of what I am than you've ever had or that anyone has ever had, though you can't really see me fully. And then after Moses has that experience, he can't put it into words in order to communicate it to us. But he sort of takes down a little bit of shorthand to try to give us some hint, some clue of what he experienced when he had the most direct experience of God's self that anyone ever had. And we recite this, every day in the liturgy, and it's a big thing that we do in Yom Kippur, in the High Holidays liturgy. And we sing it, and just as I'm teaching it, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emes. And it goes on. It's the 13 attributes of God. The first two are God's name. Like the first two attributes are just his name because we can't even understand those attributes of God. They're just whatever God is, and we call him by name. But one of the qualities of God that we're focusing on now is Erech Apayim. Now that's usually translated as slow to anger. Here, they're translating in the Koran Talmud as long-suffering. Same idea, slow to anger, long-suffering. But what the sages are pointing out here, what Rabbi Chagai is pointing out, is that it should have said Erech Af. One is slow to anger. But it says Erech Apayim. It's almost like they are slow to anger. There's a plural here. That doesn't make sense. It should have been singular. And so he learns out from this phrase that in the Hebrew is plural, where you would have expected it to be singular, that God is long-suffering in two ways. And what are those ways? He's long-suffering with the righteous, and he's long-suffering with the wicked. And Rabbi Chagai, he doesn't really explain what he means by that. He just says long-suffering with the righteous, long-suffering with the wicked. And then we're going to return to our Mishna. So I'm saying, okay, so this is Sal thinking about what this might mean. I don't claim that anybody else said this. But what it means to me, to be long-suffering with the righteous and long-suffering with the wicked, like we understand, okay, long-suffering, and that's why it's usually translated as slow to anger in terms of the wicked. That like he lets us get away with so many injustices in this world, so many sins, so many transgressions, and he doesn't punish us. Because the wicked don't get punished in this world, right? He kind of like lets it go. But eventually we get punished, whether in this world or in the next world. So it makes more sense. But if you add to it long suffering with the righteous, what does that mean, right? Why would, when we do good deeds and righteous deeds, why would that make God suffer and to be long suffering? And I would say that the answer is because he would like to reward us immediately, and he can't. He has tied his own hands, as it were, by creating a world where God is hidden. That's the whole purpose of this world, right? In this world, God is hidden. That's why we're free to make decisions whether to do right or whether to do wrong. So if every time people did good, they were rewarded, and every time people did bad, they were punished, and it happened quickly, and the consequences were pretty obvious, well, then we would all know that God was running the world and that, you got to do good or you're just going to get nailed for it like right away. It's like, like a big man, a big angry teacher running right after you and you say one wrong thing or do one wrong thing and he gives you a patch on the, like a little slap with a teacher's yardstick or something on the head or on the butt, God forbid. So if we had those immediate consequences, whether for good or for bad, well, then God wouldn't be hidden in this world. So God needs to be hidden in this world because that's the way God set it up so that we would be free to make our own choices. But it causes God pain. And so that's kind of and that's where we started today's discussion, and that's where we're going to end up. This idea that God is emotional with respect to us. How do we know that? It says it in the Torah in several places that God is a jealous God, a zealous God. God does get angry when people offend God's honor, when we treat each other badly. God doesn't like it. When we act like hypocrites and bring offerings in the temple, but then we go and, treat the orphan and the widow with contempt. God doesn't like it when we behave that way. It makes God angry. And conversely, when we bring offerings and we do what God asked us to do, and then they're burned in the temple and the incense, it creates a pleasing aroma to God. It says a pleasing aroma. And so we're able to both anger and please God. God is emotional about us, even though God is an infinite being and we're just so small and tiny and ephemeral, at least in our human lives. And yet we have here in this world the ability to anger or please God. Why? Why would that be? Why would God have emotions with respect to us? Because God loves us. God gave us that power to cause God to have emotions about us, right? It's the ultimate humility for an infinite being to put us in a situation where we could cause God suffering or joy. It's incredible that God would give us that power, but God willingly did that because God loves us, right? And so it's a suffering, a kind of suffering for God. All of this is anthropomorphizing. And as Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, we shouldn't even say any of these things except that it says in the Torah. I mean, we can draw it from the Torah, this idea that God is emotional. We're not just making that up. And so God suffers, as it were, because he can't punish us or reward us as we deserve to be punished or rewarded, and quickly. Speedy justice, both for good and for bad. God would certainly prefer to do that. But if God did that, then God wouldn't be hidden in this world. So the rules of the world that God created require that God keep God's hands off, but it costs him, right? In the same way that, you need to let your children become independent and do what they're going to do. So you have to a little bit not be a helicopter parent. But then when they do good, you cavil. And when they do bad, it's just so awful when your kids do something wicked. And you have to watch that. And it's the same thing as God watches us, right? So have a little bit of sympathy for the Holy One, that he has created a situation for our benefit, but which requires that God keep God's hands off. And that's not easy for God. So have a little sympathy for the Almighty. Okay. We return to our discussion. And if you have questions or comments about that, please put them in. We'll be there soon enough. Okay, so we return to our Mishna. We were talking about a well in the public domain and creating a virtual enclosure using corner posts so that we can draw water out of it. And the question that we were just asking, that the Mishna asked, is how big can the enclosure be? Rabbi Yehuda said, as big as 2 base seah. And so we saw that was the measure, about 70 cubits by 70 cubits, right? About 5,000 square cubits, which is about enough land to grow 2 measures of grain. And that's why it says 2 base seah. A seah is a measure of grain. But the rabbis said, no, the enclosure can be much larger than that, up to 10 base core. So a core is a much bigger measure, and it's 10 of them. I mean, it's like a much, much larger area than what Rabbi Yehuda was saying. So Rabbi Yehuda would say to the rabbis, well, hold on a second. When you're talking about these other kinds of enclosures, because the rabbis will point to other enclosures, like around a pen or a stable or a courtyard or a backyard, and that these can be much larger than just the measure of 2 base sa. So Rabbi Yehuda would say to them, well, wait a minute, those other kinds of enclosures have proper mechitzos, proper partitions, in other words, a complete fence around them. Not like the well, where we just have these corner posts and it's like a virtual fence, not a real fence. It's so symbolic. There's so little of the actual fence there. So we shouldn't allow this well enclosure to be so big like those other enclosed areas, the pen, the stable, the courtyard, or the backyard. But the rabbis say, no, we say it can be bigger, and the law follows the rabbis in their disagreement with Rabbi Yehuda on this question. The enclosure around the well can be as big as necessary. However, once it starts to get big, you do have to put in additional posts between the corner posts, not like a whole fence worth of them. They can have big gaps, but the gaps can't be any bigger than, as we learned in the beginning of this discussion about wells, the gaps between the posts can only be as big as the room needed to take a team of oxen, 4 oxen that are yoked together, because that's the way they would work a big farm, right? With 4 oxen yoked together and pulling a plow. So you could take 1 team of oxen toward the water and in the well, and 1 team of oxen away from the water in the well. And so the gap can be as big as 8 oxen across. In other words, 2 teams of 4 that are yoked together. And that's how big the gap can be. If it's any bigger than that, you need additional boards between the corner posts. So once you've got those in between boards, you can make the enclosure grow and grow and grow. You just can't have gaps bigger than 8 oxen in that enclosure. Okay. But if the okay, so then we have this rule that, okay, well, those bigger enclosures, like a stable, a pen, a courtyard, a backyard. So those kinds of enclosures are related to dwellings, right? They're either the courtyard, that literally the house is within that courtyard, or a backyard that abuts onto the property where the dwelling is. Even a pen for animals, or a stable, a corral, some kind of enclosure like that is attached to the farm, as it were, attached to the farm property. But if we're talking about some other kind of enclosure that isn't part of the property related to a residence, to a dwelling, then we agree with Rabbi Yehuda that 2 base sa is the maximum size for that, quite a bit smaller. And we get that ruling from Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. And with respect to, is it a dwelling enclosure or is it some kind of other enclosure like for storage? Interesting, it depends on what was the purpose of that enclosure when the fence was originally put up. Even if the purpose of the enclosure changes later, we're not going to permit carrying there on Shabbos if it now has dimensions that are too big and it was originally designated for storage. We're going to keep that original designation. That's the end of our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 2. Now we move on to, we're going to open this discussion of Mishnah number 2. And so now we're back. We're still talking about a well with these corner posts around it to create a virtual enclosure so we can draw water out of it on Shabbos. And now the new case that we're talking about is, well, what if this well is right in the middle of the public thoroughfare, right? So let's imagine this is a place where the festival pilgrims are going up to Jerusalem. And because of the location of the well, it's like people are walking through the enclosure all the time, right? So it's like the well is in the middle of the road, and all these people who are coming and going are walking right through what are supposed to be the partitions, the fence, the enclosure around the well. Now, we've said a virtual enclosure just made of corner posts or possibly a few more posts if it's pretty large. it counts enough so that we can draw water, we can carry within the enclosure. But if people are constantly walking through that fence, doesn't it undermine the validity of that fence as an enclosure, as a mechitzas, partitions that allow us to carry within it? Okay, so we said it's a virtual enclosure so that we can draw water. But if people are walking through it, doesn't that undermine that ruling? And so Rabbi Yehuda says if the path of the people is to walk right through that enclosure, then we need to redirect the path. We actually need to make the path detour around the enclosure that's around that well, so that, we show that that enclosure has some spiritual significance, and we don't just walk between the corner posts just because there is no fence there. Now it's like we're really negating the idea of the virtual fence, as it were. So we should redirect the path around that enclosure. But the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and said, no, the virtual enclosure is a virtual enclosure even if people walk through it. And the law is like the rabbis. Now, Rabbi Yochanan looks at this Mishnah and he really identifies with Rabbi Yehuda. He's like, really? Are we going to make partitions just built of corner posts and a sideboard here and there? We're going to make that count as a partition that we can carry within it on Shabbos, right? This like fence around the Torah to protect us from transgressing the prohibition of carrying on Shabbos. And okay, I understand what you're saying. We're going to make it a virtual partition because we need that leniency so that people can take water, and we can't always build a proper fence around the well. But people are just going to walk right through it willy-nilly as if there's no fence there, showing no respect for this virtual partition that we're trying to erect. If so, because Rabbi Yochanan doesn't like that idea. He thinks that Rabbi Yehuda is right. And if so, if the law is like the rabbis rather than like Rabbi Yehuda, well, then why don't we just see how far we can take this idea of partitions, and that don't really have meaning. And so now, I'm not saying he's getting sarcastic, but he starts to become a little bit fanciful and colorful. And so to sort of, in critiquing this ruling of the rabbis and of overruling Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, so really what we should say is that nobody should be liable for carrying in the public domain. Right? Recall that if you carry in a public domain something more than 4 cubits on Shabbos, so you violated Shabbos. If you did it unwittingly, now you're liable to bring a sin offering if the temple is standing. Right? When the temple was standing, you'd be liable to bring a sin offering in the holy temple. If you did it inadvertently, if you did it intentionally, it's a bigger punishment, and you can't bring the sin offering in order to get out of it. But Rabbi Yochanan says, no, actually, there is no public domain in Israel. You can carry anywhere you want, whatever you want on Shabbos. There's going to be no liability. Why? Because in the west of Israel, he's talking about northern Israel, where a lot of this learning was going on. But in northern Israel, there's cliffs in the west, and there's mountains in the east, right, along the Jordan River. There's mountains in northern Israel, and in the west, there's cliffs near the ocean. And between the cliffs and the mountains, according to Rabbi Yochanan, so we've got partitions. We've got big partitions, very big partitions, cliffs and mountains. So between them, it's like one big private domain anybody can carry on Shabbos. What? Why not? And Abaye says to Rav Dimi, well, is he kidding or is he being serious? Because if he's serious, well, then over here in Babylonia, there's no liability for carrying on Shabbos either, because we have the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, and they kind of curve around each other, and like there's a big land area between the two rivers. And okay, so we've got these two rivers surrounding this large area of land, and therefore that's all one big private domain. There is no public domain. We can carry on Shabbos anywhere we go, right? Says Abaye to Rav Dimi. And while we're at it, why are we worried about rivers? In fact, all of the continents in the world are surrounded by oceans. So if the oceans are going to act like partitions, they're going to be boundaries where, okay, you can't go any further. So the oceans surround all the land, and therefore there's no private domain there's no public domain anywhere, and anybody can carry on Shabbos, right? What they're saying is they're taking the argument, it's sort of like the slippery slope argument, and taking it to such an extreme that it becomes ridiculous. And that's the point that they're making. And so maybe, therefore, the rabbis have gone a little bit too far in saying that, the virtual, like if we're going to have virtual partitions, okay, but let's respect them and not let people walk through them. And along these same lines, Ravin says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and what's more, another reason why Israel has no public domain is because the land is all undulating, right? There's a lot of elevation changes, mountains and hills and ups and downs. And from where do we get the law of the public domain? So it was the big encampment of the Israelites when we were wandering in the wilderness, the 40 years in the wilderness. And there we were generally in a flat desert, a flat wilderness. And the public domain was defined by the area between the banners, meaning that the banners of the tribes that were arranged in an array. The Levites were in the center along with the tabernacle, and then there were 3 tribes in the north, 3 in the east, 3 in the south, 3 in the west. And it was like this big area, that was the public domain, the space between the banners. That's what a public domain is, and that's where we get this idea that a public domain has to have at least the possibility that 600,000 people walk through it, because there were at least 600,000 people in that encampment. But since Israel, with all its undulations, is not like the flat area of the wilderness, so we don't really have a public domain anywhere. Again, I'm not saying they're being sarcastic, but they're sort of pushing that argument to show that it should fall apart, and therefore we should respect those virtual partitions around the well. Rava asks a question of Rava. He says, well, what if we make what if we're using as a partition around some kind of enclosure, whether it's a well or something else, a mound, right? So we saw that one of those corner posts could be a mound of dirt, as long as it's steep enough that it has to rise at least 10 handbreadths within a space of, I think, 4 cubits. So it has to have a certain steepness on the mound for it to act as a corner post or partition. The question is, well, what if people typically walk over that mound? Does it still count as a mound? So according to the rabbis in our Mishna, yes, it still counts, and therefore we would not be liable for carrying in the area one of whose partitions is that mound. But Rava understands the question, and he says, well, yeah, no. If the people disrespect it, then it shouldn't count. And according to, Rava sees it like Rabbi Yehuda, that if people disrespect the partition, then it invalidates the enclosure, and you're going to be liable for carrying there on Shabbos. Rava held like Rabbi Yehuda. It invalidates. What if? So then Rava says, okay, well, wait a minute. What if it's not a mound that it's easy for people to walk over? What if it's a slope that's so steep that people can only traverse it using a rope? So it'd be kind of very inconvenient for people to walk over this natural feature that we're using as a mound. So now he's like sort of backing it away. He's trying to get us more into the camp of the rabbis. And Rava says, well, no, if there's a possibility that people walk over this partition, then that's going to invalidate the enclosure. But we're going to hold like the rabbis. Rava agrees with Rabbi Yehuda and with Rabbi Yochanan that people should respect the partitions, the surround that are used to surround this enclosure where we're going to carry on Shabbos. But the rabbis say we're not going to be that stringent. Why? At the end of the day, the reason they're not going to be overly stringent is because we're talking about a rabbinic construct to begin with. Right? When we're talking about this virtual fence around the Torah, it's a legal construct created by the rabbis to keep us from transgressing something that's already questionable as a biblical commandment. It's more like, so that's why the rabbis are very reticent to pile rabbinic decrees on top of rabbinic decrees. And so Torah laws are always going to be guarded very stringently, but rabbinic laws are going to be much more lenient. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. We return to our Mishnah, but before we forget, we had that beautiful digression, really looking at this topic of why do we live in a world where it seems like the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer so often. And we had that wonderful approach to that question from Rabbi Haggai, who said that God suffers, right? That God suffers because the righteous go unrewarded and quickly, right? Like promptly. God suffers because the righteous are not promptly rewarded. And God suffers because the wicked are not promptly punished in this world. But it's necessary for the world to be that way so that God's presence remains hidden. All right, let's see if we've got some questions or comments on our daf today. Sharon Frant Brooks. My understanding had always been that hand washing with a bracha, with nothing said before hamotzi and the use of salt, was all connected to the replacement of the priestly actions. This is the first I heard of the connection to Solomon. Right, so again, like after the temple was destroyed, we have this idea that the morning and afternoon prayers replace the morning and afternoon sacrifices. But it's not like those prayers were invented at the time that the temple was destroyed and we could no longer bring those sacrifices and we needed a replacement. And then we invented the morning prayers and the afternoon prayers. Already the people were praying in the morning and the afternoon. The rabbis kind of just more formalized the script for those prayers, as it will. They codified the Amidah, also known as the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings, and said that it now replaces in our service to God what were the communal offerings brought in the morning and in the afternoon. There's a question about the evening prayer, since there was no evening offering in the temple, whether it's as obligatory as the morning and afternoon prayers. At any rate, they existed already. And likewise, hand washing before eating a meal existed already, but then later when the temple was destroyed, we could say that it reminds us of the ablutions that the priests would undertake when they were performing their service in the temple. There is a connection, but yeah, it existed and it was instituted by Solomon, as we learned here on our daf. Lynn, with respect, perhaps we can say Hashem does not delay payment to the righteous. Rather, he does pay immediately. But it rests in a domain we have not yet attained. We also do not delay payment. So I think maybe Lynn is saying it's a very beautiful idea that it's not just that God is storing up that reward for the righteous and it's going to come to us when we leave this world and we're in the next world. Not just that he's storing up punishment for the wicked and it's going to come to us in the next world, but rather that somehow God sets in motion rewards and punishments in this world, and he's able to do that while retaining, God's hidden nature in this world. And I certainly would not disagree with that. It's just he does it in a way that his presence remains hidden. Bill Eldridge. It appears that this question of what it means to say that God repays and punishes and such is tied up in God's attribute of justice. It's not as if God is as petty as we are in our emotions, but rather that God does indeed feel moved, not by us, but by his own just nature. I mean, look, I love God. I really, really love God. I freely admit that I can't even begin to grasp, how amazing God is. And just with the tiny little bit that I understand of God, it's enough for me to really love God. But I think that, I definitely have trust in God, that God is just completely just and completely good. And so I agree with you there. But I also think that God is not petty. There's no pettiness in God. But I think God is emotional, right? God allows God's self to be emotional. It's amazing. It's related to this Kabbalistic idea of a tzimtzum, right? That God contracted God's self seemingly out of a space within God, right? Because the whole physical universe exists within God. It's not that like we're here and God is somewhere else. We're inside God. But in this space that God created within God for the universe to exist, it's like God's nature is hidden in that world. And so in making that contraction, God, it's almost like God allows God's self to be emotional, which would seem like a limitation on a perfect being. But as Rabbi David Aaron would say, is God going to be denied the glory and the sweetness of becoming more perfect, of having an emotion that was at one point frustrated and then eventually rewarded, right? Like everyone knows that if you're just given a wonderful victory dinner, right? Like the banquet at the end of a season, if you attend an end of season banquet for a sports team, right? And you're just a guest there. You happen to be in the restaurant and they let you sit down at the table with this sports team that's celebrating winning the championship at the end of a hard-fought season, right? So you're eating the same food as this team that went through a whole tough season. That food is going to taste good, but it's not going to be as sweet. It's not going to hit the spot for you the way that it would for the members of that team because of what they went through, right? So if God is a perfect being, can God have the experience of struggling, having some losses, pulling it together, and then finally, coming through and winning at the last second? Is God going to be denied that pleasure? The answer is no. God is able to experience those things through us, right? God is able to experience those things through us. And because God is able to experience those things, it's not just like a phony feeling. God feels these things, right? And so we're able to give God pleasure with good conduct, and we're able to give God anger only because God created this. It's not that we have this power. It's only because God set it up this way. Anyway, this is getting a little theological probably for some of the audience. All right, last comment. Kelsa Canedo also has to do with what humans consider punishment and reward. We may see it different than God's view. Amen. Absolutely. And the classic example, this will just be the last comment, of this given in the Talmud is this idea that, the king comes walking through a room where the very young prince is playing, right? And so it's just a little kid. And the little kid has spent an hour building a house out of sticks, or maybe you can imagine Legos. And he really put all of his heart and soul into building this little toy house. And then, some guest in the castle, was in a hurry, opened the door quickly, and the door, blew into the little toy house and just ripped it to pieces. And now the kid is just sobbing, shrieking, so upset over this loss. And the king chuckles to himself. Why? Because the king can see that, first of all, this experience of building something and losing it, it's going to be productive for the young prince. It's going to be something that he learns from. But moreover, the king can see that this little prince one day is going to be a king. There's great, great things in store for this young prince. He just doesn't see it now, right? And likewise, God has great things in store for us. We just can't see it now. And as Kelsa says, whatever reward and punishment is, the way that it really works in the higher world, it's not revealed to us now. We can't see it. But our faith in God is all the good will be rewarded. All the wickedness will be dealt with, and it will be dealt with, whether that's punishment or adjustment or, whatever it's going to be. When we look at how the whole system works from more that heavenly point of view, we're going to say, oh, God had it. He had it. God's got this, right? Nina and I always say, Hashem's got this, right? When we see terrible things happening in the world, when there's things to worry about, just have faith, Hashem has this. We don't understand it. We may not understand it till we leave this world, but Hashem's got this. That's what I've got for us today. Look forward to learning with you, my holy sisters and brothers, my dear friends, my pals,